On the Principles of Nature, chapters 1 and 2, according to St. Thomas Aquinas. Before we begin to summarize chapters 1 and 2 of On the Principles of Nature by Thomas Aquinas, we need a quick Latin crash course. That's because certain words Aquinas used are very technical terms, and the fact that they are technical terms is more easily captured by keeping in mind the Latin term which Aquinas originally used. We're going to have to memorize the meaning of the two Latin words ens and esse, ens being spelled E-N-S and esse being spelled E-S-S-E. Esse literally means to be. It's an infinitive verb like to run or to hit or to walk. Common translations of esse are to be, which is the most literal translation, being, or even existence. The word ens, which is spelled E-N-S, is very similar to esse, but doesn't mean exactly the same thing. Ens literally means being. Ens is a participle or a noun. It's like running or runner. Common translations of ens are a being and being. Even though sometimes esse and ens are translated using the same words, it's important to keep them distinguished. So, if you're using a version of Aquinas' writings in which you have the Latin side by side with the English, make sure to check the Latin to see whether the word ens or esse is being used. We will also have to memorize the meaning of the two technical terms per se and per accidens. Per se is spelled P-E-R space S-E. Per accidens is spelled P-E-R space A-C-C-I-D-E-N-S. Per se is a phrase that's often used in regular English conversation, but it's usually used incorrectly. So you'll want to forget the way you usually use this word and make sure you understand the way Aquinas uses the word. Per se, since it's two words, comes from per and se. It literally means by itself. The word per is a preposition denoting causality. It literally means something like by or through. Se is a reflexive pronoun, meaning itself. Common translations of per se are by itself, in itself, through itself, alone, essential, and essentially. If you see any of these phrases, there's a good chance that what the translator is translating is the phrase per se. The phrase per accidens designates the exact opposite of per se. It's translated as by accident. Other common translations of per accidens are accidental, accidentally, coincidentally, and coincident. If you see any of these phrases, there's a very good chance that what's being translated is per accidens. Again, per se and per accidens are opposite terms. Now let's start with chapter 1 of On the Principles of Nature by Thomas Aquinas. This chapter is about act and potency. Aquinas begins with two divisions of existence, or esse. The first division divides esse into being in potency and being in act, that is, into possible being and actual being. What is a being in potency can be, but is not. What is a being in act already is. The second division of esse is into essential or substantial existence, which in Latin is esse essentiale and esse substantiale, and accidental existence, which in Latin is esse accidentale. Examples of essential or substantial existence are the fact that man exists, and examples of accidental existence are the fact that man is white. Since esse essentiale designates merely the fact that man exists, this is called to be simply, or simply to be. In Latin, esse simpliciter. Because accidental existence brings in some other factor besides the mere existence of a subject. This is called to be in a certain respect, or to be secundum quid, or esse secundum quid. There are two kinds of potency corresponding to the two kinds of esse we just saw. The first kind of potency is potency to substantial existence. The second kind is potency to accidental existence. Potency to substantial existence does not have esse per se, but only has esse through that which comes to it. This makes sense because, as we already saw, substantial existence has to do with simply existing. So a potency to simply existing would not itself exist. It wouldn't exist per se. Other names for potency to substantial existence are matter out of which in Latin is matter ex qua, and matter properly speaking. If Aquinas uses the word matter without further qualification, there's a good chance he means potency to substantial existence, although sometimes the word matter covers both potency to substantial existence and potency to accidental existence. Potency to accidental existence, unlike potency to substantial existence, does have existence per se. It does not have existence from what comes to it. Other names for potency for accidental existence are matter in which, in Latin, matter in qua, or subject, properly speaking. If Aquinas uses the word subject, there's a good chance he means potency to accidental existence, though, like the word matter, subject can sometimes loosely be used for both potency to substantial existence and potency to accidental existence. Nevertheless, properly speaking, subject means potency to accidental existence, and matter means potency to substantial existence. Here are some examples. Sperm and egg are the matter out of which Socrates comes to be. Therefore, sperm and egg are potency to substantial existence. In contrast, Socrates himself is the subject for color or whiteness. Therefore, Socrates is a potency to accidental existence. He already exists before that which comes to him, namely the color of whiteness. Now let's talk about form. Substantial form is that by which something has substantial existence. Substantial form corresponds to matter, that is, matter properly speaking, which is a potency to substantial existence. An example of substantial form is the soul of an animal. That's because the soul is that by which an animal comes into existence. Accidental form is that by which something has accidental existence, or esse accidentale. Accidental form corresponds to the subject, properly speaking, that is, to the potency for accidental existence, or esse accidentale. Accidental form can also be called an accident. Sometimes we'll use the word accident instead of accidental form. An accident here does not mean something like when two cars run into each other. Rather, it's a technical term which just means accidental form. Some examples of accidental forms or accidents are color, virtue, knowledge, shape, age, weight, height, health, and sickness. Now that we've talked about matter and form, it's time to talk about different kinds of change. Now, a change that moves from non-being to being is a generation, or a coming to be. On the other hand, a change that moves from being to non-being is called a corruption, or a ceasing to be. Now, if a change begins with a matter without some form, and ends with a substantial form, then that change is a substantial generation, because you're moving from simply non-being to being something, simply speaking. On the other hand, if a change moves from substantial form to the lack of that substantial form in some matter, then we have a substantial corruption. On the opposite end, If we move from some pre-existent subject, which is a non-being with respect to some accidental form, to the actual possession of that accidental form, then we have an accidental generation. If we go in the reverse direction and have a motion from the possession of some accidental form to non-being with respect to that accidental form in the same subject, then we have an accidental corruption. Non-being, from which generation begins and in which corruption ends, is not absolute non-being, but a relative non-being. What does that mean? Some subject or matter does not have being with respect to some particular form to which it is in potency, despite the fact that it does have being under some other form. Let's give a few examples to make this a little clearer. So first we have sperm and egg. This is non-being, not simply speaking, obviously, because sperm and egg aren't purely nothing. But it is non-being in this sense. It's matter without substantial form of a dog. But then through substantial generation, we get the being of a dog. This is the same matter plus substantial form of a dog. Here's a second example of substantial generation. We have an acorn. This obviously isn't non-being simply speaking. It's not nothing at all, but it is a non-being in this respect. It's matter without the substantial form of a tree. But through substantial generation, we get a tree, which is a being. The tree is matter plus substantial form of a tree. Here's an example of accidental generation. First, we have the baby asleep. This is a non-being in this respect. It is a subject, that is a pre-existent subject, without accidental form of being awake. But then, when through accidental generation the baby acquires the accidental form of being awake, we've moved from non-being to being. Here are some other examples of accidental generation. Going from non-tan to tan, for instance, from walking out in the sun. Or going from non-adult to adult. This would happen when someone grows up. Or going from non-fat to fat. This happens when someone eats too much. Now, all of these examples of accidental generation can, from another perspective, be viewed as examples of accidental corruption. Let's see how. First, let's look at the first example. Going from non-tan to tan could also be viewed as going from pale to non-pale. Thus, what was previously, from the previous perspective, viewed as accidental generation is now, from the present perspective, viewed as accidental corruption, a motion from being to non-being. Going from non-adult to adult can be viewed as going from youth to non-youth. This is now an accidental corruption. The accidental generation of going from non-fat to fat can be viewed from another perspective as going from skinny to non-skinny. Thus, the accidental generation can also be viewed as an accidental corruption. Let's look at an example of substantial corruption. First, we start with a being, matter plus the substantial form of a human. This is a fully alive Socrates. He has a soul or substantial form. But then Socrates takes some poison, undergoes substantial corruption, and now he's dead. So we've moved from being to non-being. Now we have a matter without the substantial form of a human or the soul. There are three requirements for any change, that is, any generation or corruption, whether substantial or accidental. And these three requirements are obvious from what we've already discussed. The three requirements are 1, matter or a subject, that is some potency or being in potency, Here we'll take as an example bronze in the statue to the right. The second requirement is privation. This is non-being in act. We'll take as our example from the statue on the right shapelessness, so bronze being shapeless. And then the third requirement is form. This is that through which something becomes a being in act. In our example, it's shape. So if we look at the statue here on the right, we have first the matter is bronze. That's that out of which the statue is made. And then the privation, which leads to the statue being made, is its shapeless bronze, the shapelessness of the bronze prior to it being made. And then finally, at the end of the change, or the generation of the statue, we have a shape, namely the shape of the statue, the shape of Caesar. In the reverse direction, if we're going to have a corruption of the statue, we start with the shape in the bronze, and then we end with shapeless bronze, for instance, if we melt down the statue. Now let's move on to chapter 2. Here we'll discuss the three principles of nature according to Thomas Aquinas. There are three principles of nature. That's because nature is an inner principle of motion and rest. But we just saw that there are three things required for change, that is, motion. These three things are matter, privation, and form. Therefore, there are three principles of nature: matter, privation, and form. Now, there are several ways of dividing these principles. A principle is either per accidens, meaning accidental, or it's per se, meaning essential. So the per accidens principle of nature is privation. That's because a principle is just what's first in some order. A privation is always first in some substantial generation, and therefore it's a principle of substantial generation, but non-being or privation doesn't actually bring about the generation, and therefore it's a per accidens principle. On the other hand, the per se principles are matter and form. We could also divide principles in another way, into principles of becoming, or in fieri, and principles of becoming and of being, in fieri et in esse. The principle of becoming merely is privation. That's because privations are not present once the being has been generated, once it has become. Nevertheless, privations are necessary at the beginning of a process of generation, even if they aren't needed at the end. On the other hand, the principles of both becoming and of being are matter and form. Why do we say that privation is a principle of nature, not negation? The reason is twofold. First, because negations are non-beings that do not determine any subject. But nature always moves from some pre-existent subject or matter. Therefore, it's more fitting to specify a privation as the principle of nature than a negation. Here's an example. A rock is non-seeing, but not blind. Non-seeing is a negation, blind is a privation. Of course, what is blind is also non-seeing, but what's non-seeing is not necessarily blind. In order to be blind, there must not only be the removal of sight, but there must also be some subject disposed to have sight. Here's another example. A tree is non-knowing. A human may also be non-knowing, but a tree is not ignorant, whereas a human might be ignorant. Since nature always moves from some determined subject or matter, it follows that we should talk about privation as a principle of nature, not negation. The second reason for talking about privation as a principle of nature, not negation, is because generation is from non-being, which is in some determinate subject, that is naturally inclined to be. Again here, we're looking at privations, not negations, because we're specifying some subject. Generation is always from some determinate subject naturally inclined to be. But if a subject is inclined to be a certain thing, and yet is deprived of that thing, then it has a privation, not a mere or absolute non-being, or negation. Now that we've talked about privation, it's time to discuss matter. Matter sometimes implies a privation of form. For instance, flour is the matter of bread. But when we speak about flour being the matter of bread, we're implying the absence of the form of bread, since obviously when bread actually exists, there's no flour anymore. On the other hand, sometimes matter does not imply a privation of form for which it is matter. For instance, bronze is called the matter of a statue. Nevertheless, bronze continues to exist when the statue's form exists. So, matter, when that word is used to imply the absence of some form, ceases to exist after generation is completed. On the other hand, matter which does not imply privation of form remains through the generation. The second way of dividing matter is this. We divide matter into secondary matter, which is itself composed out of some more basic matter and form. For instance, bronze, which is composed out of some more basic matter. And primary matter, which is also called prime matter. Now, prime matter is understood without any form or privation whatsoever. It abstracts from both form and privation. But prime matter cannot be known or defined except for in reference to form. That's because we always know and define things by means of how they are actual, that is, through their form. Here's an example. Look at the baby. The baby is composed out of matter. Most proximately, it's composed out of organs. But the organs are composed out of the matter which is tissue. And the matter of the tissue is the cells. And the matter of the cells is the organelles. And the matter of the organelles is the chemical compounds that make up the organelles. And the matter of the chemical compounds is the atoms. These atoms make up the chemical compounds. But the atoms themselves are composed out of something further, subatomic particles, like electrons, neutrons, and protons. These, in turn, are made up of something else, and so on. Eventually, however, we must come to some most basic thing, which is not composed out of anything else. This is prime matter. There are two senses of prime matter. First, prime matter might mean prime matter in some genus, or the first matter in some genus. Here's an example. Water is the primary matter of aqueous solutions because it's the most basic thing out of which all aqueous solutions are made. Likewise, organelles are the primary matter of the genus of living things because they're the most basic parts, or matter, out of which living things are made. On the other hand, when we speak about prime matter, we most of the time don't mean primary matter in some genus, but instead we mean primary matter simply speaking. In this case, prime matter relates to all forms, not just the forms of some genus, but all forms and all privations as or in the same way that bronze relates to the shape of a statue and the privation of that shape. In other words, primary matter, simply speaking, is deprived of all form and all privation. Here are some final notes about matter and form. Neither primary matter nor form is ever generated or corrupted. That's because, as we saw, generation and corruption are from form and from matter. So, if we have primary matter, which itself is not composed out of any more basic matter and form, then it's impossible for it to be generated or corrupted. Prime matter cannot exist without some form or another. That's because primary matter, as we've seen, is pure potency. That is, it's entirely without any act or form. And since nothing exists except what is actual, primary matter cannot exist unless it has some form.